The Indiana Jones movies are pretty great, and I feel I haven't given them enough credit over the years. This is a franchise that is pretty much on the same level as the original Star Wars and Back to the Future trilogy in terms of popularity and impact. And yet, I've never really given them that much respect. Mostly because I didn't exactly grow up watching these movies as often as I did the other ones. I watched Raiders quite a bit, but not as often as something like A New Hope or the first Back to the Future. I don't know exactly why, I just never did. But over the past couple of years, I've been watching them more and more and have come to the conclusion that these movies are all pretty great. Yeah, you heard me. Even the ones that people don't like as much. I've grown to appreciate these movies recently, and I want to talk about what it is I love so much about them. I want to convert as many of you into fans of this series to make up for the fact that I haven't been giving them that much attention over the years. I mean, sure, these movies have clearly been doing well in terms of critical and audience response, so this video may not say anything new. But I want to make myself feel better and acknowledge how great this franchise truly is. Don't be like me and take these movies for granted, because they're a lot of fun. Alright, enough of the intro, let's begin. Raiders of the Lost Ark is quite possibly one of the most iconic movies in film history. This is on the same level as the original Star Wars and The Godfather and Pulp Fiction, a movie that's been referenced to death by pop culture. Even if you've never seen these movies in their entirety, you get every reference. You understand what they're about, and you know what they represent in film history. But despite the constant references, the movies still seem fresh and new when you actually see them. And Raiders is the same way. I don't often call a film perfect, but I would make the argument that this is like the most perfect adventure movie ever. It has everything. It has action, it has violence, it has romance, it has humor. It has great stunt work, it has Nazis as the villains, and it has some really scary imagery that will scar you and end up on one of those top 10 scariest scenes in movies we saw as kids list. And yet with all those elements, the movie still feels simple. One of my favorite aspects of this movie is how simple it feels. This is not a complicated story to follow, nor is it deep in its themes. It is exactly like Star Wars, even down to having a similar cast. Like I've said about Star Wars, the charm of those movies comes from the simplicity of it all, and it's the exact same thing here. Indy is not a complex character. He's an archaeologist sent to find this very specific MacGuffin and make sure it never gets into the hands of the Nazis. He's cool and suave, yet knows his shit and when to punch a guy in the face. He doesn't go on some spiritual journey or changes as a character. That's not this kind of movie. It's a simple story about simple characters. You want to know how I know this movie isn't meant to be seen as anything complex? Because the villains are literally the Nazis. The easiest people you can make the villains in any media ever are the bad guys. This movie is not hard to figure out. You could be 2 years old and figure out this movie. Now, for some people, this constant simplicity might make or break the movie for you. Just because something is easy to follow does not mean it's exempt from criticism. Admittedly, yeah, this movie would probably be a bit more engaging if Indy was a more defined character, as would his relationship with Marion, and his relationship with all these characters. But honestly, the movie doesn't feel like it needs to be anything more than what it is. It knows exactly what kind of movie it wants to be and doesn't try to be anything it's not. This is why it's remained so iconic, because of how simple it is. The complexities of this movie come in the form of the stunts, action, and set design, not the story and characters. Everyone remembers the boulder scene, everyone remembers the caves and ancient ruins, everyone remembers the face melting scene and how cool and terrifying it is.
Hans Mole Man Productions presents Man Getting Hit by Football.
Now admittedly, yes, people should probably remember stuff like the stories and characters first, and then the extra stuff like stunts and effects second. I agree with people who are probably pretty underwhelmed with this movie. But this is why I say this is a perfect adventure movie. I'm not saying this movie is perfect from a dramatic standpoint, or that it's on the same level as something like Citizen Kane or Godfather from a storytelling perspective. From an action-adventure movie standpoint, this movie hits all the right notes. I don't need scenes of Indy talking about his feelings or a complex villain that challenges my worldview. I'm here to watch an adventure ensue, and that's exactly what I get. Again, I get the criticisms, but when I look at this movie and what it's trying to accomplish, I think it succeeds very well in that regard. Personally, I wouldn't change a thing about it. I think it's perfect just the way it is. So I'm giving Raiders of the Lost Ark a big ol' 10 out of 10. I feel as though The Temple of Doom is in the same boat as Return of the Jedi, a movie that's seen as the worst of the original three, and yeah, that's kinda true. I'm not gonna lie, if you don't think Temple of Doom is your cup of tea, I completely understand. However, I still kinda love this movie. Now when I first watched it about a year or so ago, I was a little put off by it. And that's because it kinda goes in two different directions with its tone. It's simultaneously more kid-friendly than the last movie, and yet maybe even a little darker. Like if I had seen this movie as a kid, I probably would have shit myself on several occasions. And for most people, I can kinda see this tonal problem really ruining the movie for them. As for the lighthearted aspects, I could see characters like Short Round and Willie appealing, or supposed to be appealing, to younger audiences. Short Round is your typical token kid character. Wow, he can drive a car and fight some guards. And he has a cool Yankees hat. Wow, he's just the damnedest thing. Also, he doesn't speak English like I do. What a wacky character. Honestly, I don't mind Short Round as much when it comes to annoying characters in movies. Like, yeah, he can be a little irritating at times, but at least he does do things to further the plot, so it's not like he's useless. That would be the job of Willie Scott. Yeah, even people who like this movie are not fans of Willie. She's annoying and screams at the tiniest things and just won't shut up at all. And the worst part is, she never changes. She's still a screaming, annoying lunatic by the end. I mean, like, come on. Even in The Good Dinosaur, at the very least has Arlo realize he needs to stop being scared of shit and actually learns how to be brave by the end. Willie never stops screaming and never changes as a character. You'd think with someone this annoying, they would at least have her make some sort of realization where she says, maybe I should stop acting like a child and contribute more. Even the literal child contributes more than she does. Yeah, I'm not a fan of her as a character. At least she's hot and fun to laugh at, but that's really about it. Personally though, that's about it for huge criticisms. The rest of the movie isn't actually that bad. I like the set design of the temple and how creepy everything is. There's an impending feeling of dread and despair, and it's just so atmospheric. I also find the villains really creepy. I'm glad it's not just a rehash of the Nazis. We honestly don't know anything about these people, so it makes them extra threatening when we see what they're capable of. I guess they could be a little more interesting, but I was fine with them. And like I said, the darker tone seems very strange considering the elements added to make it seem more family friendly. But I like this darker stuff too. Seeing a guy get his heart ripped out of his chest and still be alive to see it is intense. There's a reason this was the movie that caused the invention of the PG-13 rating. Indy is still his usual cool self, the humor is way more funny in this one, and that minecart chase is just so cool. I will admit, this one is not as good as Raiders and is probably the weakest Indiana Jones movie of the original three, but despite my criticisms, I still enjoyed this a lot more than I had previously thought. I honestly loved it a lot more on rewatch, so if you feel it wasn't that great on your first watch, I recommend giving it another shot. It's a movie that may not win some people over, but I still thought it was a good time regardless. So I'm giving Temple of Doom a generous 9 out of 10.
Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade.
So since Temple of Doom wasn't as well received, it's no wonder why Last Crusade has so many similarities to Raiders. The Nazis are back in this one, Marcus and Sala are back in this one, they're searching for a famous religious item, even down to the text the opening title and credits use is very similar to Raiders. However, to say this movie is to Raiders what Force Awakens is to A New Hope would be absolutely incorrect. I would make the argument that Last Crusade is actually better than Raiders, but only by a tiny bit. I said that Raiders is a perfect adventure movie, but things like the story and characters leave much to be desired. Well, Last Crusade fixes that and actually does something pretty profound. It gives Indy a character arc. See, in this movie, Indiana Jones and his father are tasked with finding the Holy Grail. This is something that his father has been obsessed with his whole life, and so never gave Indy that much attention as a kid. And so we get a little more info into who Indy is as a character. We get a backstory at the beginning about Indy first thwarting who he thinks are bad guys from taking an ancient artifact. We even get an origin about where he got his chin scar. We see Indy interact with his father and explain how he never felt like the two ever saw eye to eye. We see them quarrel with one another, but also work well together because they're family. They may have disagreements, but at the end of the day, they're still family and they still love each other in some way. Basically, this film is for people who felt a little underwhelmed by Raiders, because everything here is like Raiders, but done a little better. It's like Empire Strikes Back and Toy Story 2. The first movies are great and have a lot to offer, but the sequels expand upon the worlds and characters to make them a little more interesting. And as usual, everything else is top notch. The action is fun and and exciting, the adventure of finding the Holy Grail is fascinating all the way through, and everything leads to a phenomenal climax. What I love about this climax is how it's Indy using everything he has to get through the challenges. He's using his wits, his smarts, his quick action, and even has to resort to his faith at one point. That scene of him taking the leap of faith is incredible and easily one of my favorite scenes in any of these movies. Hell, maybe one of my favorite scenes in any movie ever. It's exactly the kind of scene I want to see in a movie like this. Something that wants to take a great idea and push it even further. Honestly, there's not much else I can say about this one before it just becomes a list of everything I love about it. This is a movie I've seen now 3 times in the last 2 years, and it just keeps getting better and better the more I revisit it. And I have no problems considering this to be one of my absolute favorite films of all time. A masterpiece of an action-adventure film and the best Indiana Jones movie. 10 out of 10, easily. So with that, I must say that the Indiana Jones trilogy is pretty great, all things considered. It's definitely not perfect, and I would probably consider other trilogies to be better personally. But when all is said and done, I think these movies were fantastic, and a fine addition to my collection. But there's one more movie to talk about. And unfortunately, like most sequels made years later to cash in on nostalgia, Kingdom of the Crystal Skull is not as good as the originals. However, I wouldn't consider myself a hater of this movie, like most people are. Now, being on the internet for years, I was always told this movie was pretty bad. I mean, when you make a Lucasfilm property in the 2000s around the time that these movies were coming out, yeah, I can imagine people would have been pretty skeptical about this being any good. And it seems it wasn't that great because not many people have given it that much praise. I mean, come on, this has a Plinkett review and everything. This movie must be on the same level as the prequels, right? Now, in all fairness, I will agree that this movie is the weakest Indiana Jones movie. The criticisms for this movie are absolutely fair. The CGI has not aged well. Like, it somehow looks worse than the practical effects used in the movies from the 80s. Also, the story about aliens seems to take things a little too far, even for Indiana Jones. Like, yeah, these movies have always had elements of the supernatural, but I don't know, for some reason, sticking aliens into the mix just didn't seem right. It's like when James Bond took place in space, it kinda crosses the line from silly to a bit dumb. And yeah, Shia LaBeouf is in this, and he doesn't really help the movie's quality all that much. And of course, this is a sequel made years later, after the originals ended. There was no way this movie was going to be welcomed with open arms from people. Only on very specific occasions does a property make a return to the mainstream after so many years and people enjoy it. So yeah, with all this in mind, I should hate this on the same level as everybody else. But not necessarily. For one, I feel like this is in the same boat as movies like the prequels and Spider-Man 3. Movies that got railed for years because the franchises they're connected to are so beloved and so cherished that even the slightest dip in quality would send people over the edge. And of course, it's not like the criticisms weren't valid. As I've said, they totally are. But recently, movies like the prequels and Spider-Man 3 have been getting a bit of a comeback. People have been treating them a little nicer and admitting that they're not as bad as maybe we had led them to be. Certainly not on the same level as their predecessors, but maybe not the level of bad that caused such vitriolic hate and bitterness. And so, I feel like Kingdom of the Crystal Skull should have a shot at redemption. Because when I watch it, I look at what it is, not what I want it to be in comparison to the originals. And when all is said and done, the movie isn't as bad as I was anticipating. It's still Indy going on an adventure, and the action and stunts are still kind of fun. Not nearly as impressive as the originals, but I still feel there's some fun to be had with them. I like the villains, I like Indy's relationship with his son and Marion. I don't think the CGI is all that great, but I like the design of everything. I was expecting at best a fun, dumb action movie, and that's exactly what I got, so I can't say that I was angry with this movie. As a last Indiana Jones movie, sure, it leaves much to be desired, and unfortunately we may get our wish with that. And when you do look at it and compare it to the likes of Raiders and Last Crusade, it absolutely is the weakest of the bunch. Like, out of all the weird and annoying shit that happens in Temple of Doom, I would definitely rewatch it over this movie. That was at least so unbelievably bizarre that I was never bored with it. This was just a decent action-adventure movie. Nothing more, nothing less. Would I have preferred something greater? Absolutely. I always want something to be at the very best it can be. But I wouldn't say I'm as angry with it as other people are. I honestly wouldn't mind rewatching it in the future at some point, and that's a success in my book. So I'm gonna be nice and give Kingdom of the Crystal Skull a 7 out of 10. I'm glad I've watched these movies a lot more in the past couple of years, because now I can say that I absolutely love them. Some are better than others, clearly, but I can't say I hated any of these movies, despite their flaws. Now with that said, when it comes down to the whole Indiana Jones versus Star Wars debate, that apparently exists, I actually had no idea that existed, I'm always going to side with Star Wars, no matter what. Those are movies I've watched countless times, and I have such a personal connection to them that they will always win in my mind. But that's not to undermine this series of movies. Indiana Jones has gone down in history as one of the most iconic adventure film series, and for good reason. The action and stunts are incredible and memorable. The characters are timeless, yet simple. The effects were groundbreaking and still remain believable. And they're simple enough for anyone to watch and enjoy in some capacity. I can't say these movies are perfect in every way, and I absolutely understand if you can't get into them as much as other people, but I feel these movies deserve their place in film history, and will always remain as iconic as they already have. So here's to you, Indiana Jones series, the best damn action-adventure film franchise there is. Also, for the love of God, please do not actually make Indiana Jones 5. You saw what they did with the sequel trilogy. You're going down a path I can't follow.